Okay, we're gonna get started here. Before we do get started, hold on. Just wanted to call your attention to a couple of extra credit studies. These are people who are looking for participants. Remember, it's only a week left till the end of this week, I should say, to participate in SONA studies. So if you do want credits, here's a couple ways to do so. This is one study where you're gonna be asked to give or answer some questions about forensic testimony. There are some links down at the bottom here. I'm not sure if you guys can see those, but I can give them to you if you want them. There's links at the bottom that if you click on those to sign up, you can do that. Just make sure you do that ASAP because, as I said, it's the last week to participate in studies. Okay. I assume this is also posted in SONA as well. So if you just look for the title, Jury Perceptions of Forensic Science Testimony 2, you should be able to find this. Okay, so this is for one SONA credit, takes about 45 minutes or so. As another option, you could participate in this study called Interpreted Interactions and Cognition. In this study, it still take 3 hours, so you can either get 3 extra credits for the study, or if you want, you can also earn $60 for participating as well. So if you want to earn a little extra money, here's another great option. Not everybody's going to be eligible, so to check your eligibility, just scan this QR code, and I believe that will let you know if you're eligible for this study. Okay. There's a few other things you need to be at least 18. You have to be Spanish, English bilingual. Okay, and willing to be video recorded. So keep that in mind as well. Okay. Okay, so again, that's interpreted interactions and cognition. Okay, so yes, we will be having a quiz today to answer your question in the chat. If you want info, you can find it on SONA, or if you want, I wonder, can I, or I'll tell you what, at the end of class, I can put it back up if you want me to put it back up. But you can find the studies in SONA, or you should be able to find them in SONA as well. Okay, but just remind me if you want to see the information at the end of class, I'll put it back up for you. Okay, a few other things, announcements that I want to make. So first off, remember that assignment number 3 is due on Thursday at 3:30. You can find that in the assignments section on Canvas. So make sure you turn that in by 3:30 via Canvas. Okay. Secondly, last class I mentioned that there's an extra credit opportunity. Let me just go to that now. Let me share my screen. Hold on. So if you go to Canvas in the module section, and let's turn on the student view. So there are 2 extra credit opportunities. Okay, you should see number 1 and number 2. All right. This extra credit opportunity number 1 is the one I mentioned last class. You have until Thursday at 3:30 to complete this extra credit one. This is the lineup task where we're just going to ask you to pick people out of a lineup. It's really simple. It takes just like a couple minutes and you'll be done. So it's a really, really easy way to get 2 points. Remember, these are 2 points in addition to what I normally give you for extra credit. Okay, so everybody can get an extra 2 points for participating. Even if you've maxed out your extra credit otherwise, you can still get an additional 2 points if you do this. So I strongly recommend everybody do this extra credit opportunity. Also, as of today, there's a second extra credit opportunity that you have. And again, this is in addition to every other extra credit opportunity that I've given you. So again, everybody can get an additional 3 points as well on top of this, on top of your regular extra credit. For this extra credit opportunity, this is, I think I mentioned this last week, where FIU needs to evaluate student learning in a number of classes in order to maintain its accreditation. And so this is one of the classes in which they do this. So it's going to be like a little short quiz about social psychology, but none of your answers or none of your score in that quiz has nothing to do with this class. You're not given a grade or anything like that. It's not going to harm your grade in any way. So again, it's just an easy way to earn an extra 3 points. So really everybody should be earning these 5 points of extra credit. Okay, and as I mentioned a minute ago, the extra credit opportunities, all of them end at the end of this week. So make sure you do your SONA studies if you want to do that. And lastly, as an alternative to the SONA studies, in the assignment section, I posted the alternative extra credit right here. Okay, this is only for people who are not getting their points via SONA. This will not get you additional points on top of what you normally get. This will be part of the 8 extra credit points you're allowed to get in the class. But you can turn in up to 3 papers and all the details are listed if you click on that. Okay. That's due at the final exam, which is a week from today. All right, so you have until Tuesday of next week to do that. But again, that's only if you haven't done your SONA studies. Okay, and then lastly, as I just mentioned, the final exam is a week from today, so Tuesday, but keep in mind it's at 2:15, not at 3:30, okay? Don't just show up at 3:30 or else you will have missed most of the exam. So at 2:15 and it's over Zoom. So if you go to the Zoom page, you will see I've created a link there for that final exam. Tuesday, April 20th at 2:15, okay? The exam is scheduled for 2 hours, but it's just going to be like the other exams. So it should only take, I think we usually finish those in about an hour or so, but there are 2 hours scheduled, but you should be out of there by about 3:15, more or less. Okay, just make sure you don't show up at 3:30 or else you will have missed the exam. Carolina, will it make you look bad if we somehow manage to get every single question wrong? Yeah, that will make me look bad. Now, not like there's any penalties for me. It'll more make students of the class look bad if that happens. So, but it would be actually a feat if you got every question wrong. You'd have to really be trying to get every question wrong, I think, to get everyone wrong. So that should not happen, I imagine. The extra credit flyers? The studies should be on SONA. What happened to my, oh, there we go, this here. Yeah, so if you just look for interpreted interactions and cognition on SONA, okay, or for this one, jury perceptions of forensic science testimony 2. Okay. The exam is not cumulative. It's just like the others, so you're only responsible for material since exam 3. That being said, you know that having gone through the stereotyping lecture in particular, we've taken some information we learned in social cognition at the beginning of the semester, and we've applied that to stereotyping, so obviously you have to know that. The other study is not on SONA, you're saying? This one here, the interpreted interactions and cognition is not on SONA. Okay, if that's the case, then I suggest you take a screenshot of this flyer. And I'll give you a few seconds if you want to do that. And as I said, if you need me to, I can also put this back up at the end of class as well. Okay, everyone's got a picture of that? All right. All right, so we have to finish talking about aggression, so let's do that. There's nothing you need to turn in for the other extra credit. So for SONA, okay, so here's how I'm gonna keep track of everything. For SONA extra credit, in your SONA account, you should have indicated that you're taking my class, okay? As long as you've indicated in your SONA account you're taking this class, I will get access to all your extra credit points. Double check that. Some people enter the wrong section of SOP 3004, and then I don't get to see your extra credit. So make sure you're signed up for the right class with me. And make sure you've assigned those extra credit points to this class as well. If you've assigned them to a different class, you don't get credit for them for this class, of course. So make sure they're assigned to this class. Okay, that's how I get your SONA. If you're turning in the alternative extra credit assignment, then you would do that via Canvas by Tuesday at the final exam. Okay. For the other 2 additional extra credit opportunities that I talked about today, I think they ask you for your name for both of them. And so I'm going to get a list of everyone who participated in those studies at the end of the semester. If in your SONA account it says 5 credits pending, that probably means the researcher that you've done studies, but the researcher hasn't yet assigned the extra credit to you. Sometimes it takes them a few days to assign extra credit to participants. That's probably what that means. Okay, any other questions? Everyone's good with extra credit assignments and everything else? They know what they have to do? Gabriella, so it should be assigned by the end of the semester. So I'm actually the faculty member in charge of SONA Systems, and my graduate student is actually the one who sends the emails reminding people when they have to do stuff. And so she's already sent one email. She's going to send another email reminding all researchers to make sure to assign extra credit by a certain date, which I think is next Tuesday or something like that. So you should have all your extra credit by Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. If you don't by that point, then you can contact me and I'll take a look into that for you. One, I'm not sure. I believe, no, it should be either money or extra credit for that one study. Yeah, you're talking about not this one. Or yeah, this one here, sorry. Nope, that one there. Yeah, it should be $60 or 3 extra credits, I believe, but you have to talk to the researchers about that. But I believe that's what it is. Okay, so let's finish up talking about aggression because we only have a few slides left of that. So we were talking about situational factors that influence aggression, and we talked about a couple of these already. I just wanted to talk about a couple more, and really one of them we've seen already. So we've seen before in this class how becoming de-individuated or entering a de-individuated state can lead to aggression, like rioting. If you recall, when we enter a de-individuated state, then we're not really focused on our internal standards of morality. We sort of take on characteristics of the group that we're a part of. So if that group is aggressive, then and if we're de-individuated, we tend to become more aggressive ourselves. So we've already seen that though in this class, so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that. But the one other factor I do want to talk about is the effect that roles can play on our behavior. So we talked about roles very briefly when we talked about group processes. I introduced this at the very beginning of that lecture. So roles refer to the prescribed set of behaviors that someone has within a situation. So within the context of this class, for instance, my role as professor is different from your role as student. And as a professor, there are certain standards I have to uphold, or there's certain set of behaviors that I'm supposed to engage in, right? I'm supposed to teach you and grade your exams and things like that. And as a student, there's a set of behaviors that you're supposed to engage in as well. You come to lectures, you take the exams, you turn in assignments, that sort of thing. And so within different contexts, people have different roles that they play. And so back in the 70s, a researcher by the name of Philip Zimbardo wanted to see whether if you just give someone a role to play, whether they will start acting in accordance with their beliefs about the roles that a person in that position would play. Okay, so this will become a little more obvious as I explain his classic study. I'm sure a lot of you have come across this study either in an intro psych class or maybe in a criminology class or something along those lines. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment. Very famous study in social psychology. And so what happened is that this researcher, Philip Zimbardo, he took a bunch of college students and he randomly assigned them to play one of two roles, okay? To play either the role of a prison guard, and this is what a prison guard looked like. So they would put on this prison uniform and these reflective sunglasses, okay? Or they played the role of prisoner. And so the prisoners were dressed more like this. They had these stocking caps on their head to simulate having their heads shaved. They wore identical smocks with numbers on them, and they were referred to only by their numbers, not by their names. And so what Zimbardo did is he converted the basement of Stanford University into a mock prison. So we actually put some bars up. So he took all these offices that were in the basement and he took everything out of the office and he put bars on the windows, as you can see here. And he put a couple cots in there. And so the prisoners would sleep on those cots. And so the study was supposed to last for 14 days, for 2 weeks. And so people signed up for, I think it was $10 a day, something like that. So he randomly assigned them to play the role of prisoners or guards. For the prisoners, he actually had police cars pull up to their homes and actually fake arrest them and bring them into this jail. And you can't see it in these pictures, but they also put like a chain on their ankle. And meanwhile, the guards were basically given free reign of this mock prison. They were given shifts they had to work in. The prisoners had to stay there all the time, like real prisoners. But the guards were given shifts to work in. And they were basically given free reign. They can do whatever they wanted within this prison, with the one exception, they couldn't actually make any physical contact with any prisoners. You couldn't do that. Other than that, you can pretty much run the prison how they wanted. Now, obviously, these aren't real prisoners, and they're not real prison guards. So they don't have to behave like actual prisoners or actual prison guards, right? But what Zimbardo wanted to know was whether just telling people, here's the role you're given, would lead people to behave consistently with that role. So he was testing the idea whether if you just tell someone they're a guard, whether they'd start to behave like guards. And if you just tell someone they're a prisoner, they'd start to behave like prisoners. But I'll tell you what, I think it's probably easier if you see some examples of what was actually happening in the study. So I'm going to show you a little clip. This is from, I think, Dateline from a number of years ago. Oops, let's try that again. And they did a segment on the Stanford prison study that I want to show you all. And you guys will let me know in the chat if you don't hear sound, but you should. Oh, actually, I don't know if you guys are hearing sound though in class. Hold on one second.
Psychology building. 30 years ago, he took ordinary people, just like you and me, and gave half absolute power as guards and made the other half totally powerless as prisoners. Then he stepped back and let human nature take over.
They have no freedom of action.
Zimbardo gave his student guards a few guidelines, but no formal training, and they quickly discovered how seductive wielding power over others could be. Just as in Iraq, the lack of proper training of U.S. guards has been cited as a contributing factor in the abuse of prisoners there. In Zimbardo's study, Dave Eshelman was one of those assigned as a guard.
Gosh, I guess you'd have to say I was pretty much a normal kid.
This 18-year-old college sophomore was an affable drama buff who had just landed the role of a lifetime. One of the prisoners was 19-year-old college student Richard Yako.
I've never forgotten my number. It's 1037.
The prisoners-to-be, who signed up for $15 a day, were surprised when real police staged arrests at their homes. They were booked, fingerprinted, and then blindfolded and transported to the mock prison, their new home for the next 2 weeks. There, the guards stripped them naked and sprayed them with deodorant as if they were being deloused. The humiliation had only begun. Tiny university offices were turned into locked cells, complete with metal bars suitable for hard time.
So there are 3 beds, each about 3 feet wide, and this entrance, and there's nothing else.
Patrolling the halls were the make-believe guards. They dressed up in military-style khakis, brandished billy clubs, and donned mirrored sunglasses.
You get a certain amount of power if you can stare into somebody's eyes and they can't see your eyes.
Zimbardo put the guards in charge and gave them total control.
Turn around, face the wall, hands against the wall.
Although physical violence was off limits, the guards learned quickly that psychological abuse could also be an effective form of humiliation, like forcing this prisoner to sing about freedom.
I saw God, I'm free. Like that.
You're not hitting somebody, you're not cursing them. That was creative evil.
Now, there's a couple ways that we can do this.
Meantime, Dave Eshelman was relishing the greatest power he'd ever had in his 18-year-old life.
Then what the hell are you talking about?
When I came in the second day, that's when I decided to see where I could go with it.
That's right, it means no blankets tonight.
The guards' treatment angered prisoners like Richard Yako.
I didn't expect to have a chain on my ankle, and I didn't expect to have my sleep disrupted.
8612, I think you have to spend a little time in the hall.
As Eshelman and his fellow guards increased the harassment and degradation, Yako and fellow prisoner Doug Corpy started a rebellion, barricading themselves inside their cells and refusing to take orders. It took the guards 4 long hours to regain control of their prison. And once they did, they were going to make the prisoners pay.
Now this is revenge time. Now this is going to show them who was really in charge.
From the day of the rebellion, everything changed in your prison.
Everything changed.
The guards were so infuriated by the rebellion and the challenge to their authority, they began tightening the screws. They forced the prisoners to scrub toilet bowls with their bare hands, suspended shower privileges, even made prisoners use buckets in their cells, which couldn't be emptied until the next day.
And here's this thing from the urine and the feces that they've been defecating in the bucket People are taking this very, very seriously.
Mr. Correctional Officer?
No one more seriously than Dave Eshelman.
Instead of just being a passive guard, I'm going to be a mean sumbitch guard. I'm going to intimidate these people.
The prisoners had a nickname for you.
Play leapfrog.
They called me John Wayne.
He really seemed to be the one that was, well, it's sometimes sadistic.
What if I told you to get down on that floor? And the floor. What would you do then?
Dave Eshelman, a.k.a. John Wayne, even brazenly broke Zimbardo's key rule, no physical contact, by stepping on the back of this prisoner, who isn't fighting back at all.
Now keep it straight.
The escalating intimidation and the deteriorating conditions had a devastating effect on several prisoners, including the two leaders of the rebellion, Doug Corpy and Richard Yako.
I can't take it.
The guards had broken them down, and they had to be released.
I don't know how to explain it. I'm inside. Out now!
You put people in position of power, you give them symbols of power, and the power corrupts.
And the power was corrupting John Wayne.
And why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein.
I think that the guards, including me, didn't know how far they could take this. As we saw the things we could get away with, it emboldened us to take, the next step.
I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
He's using us like puppets. It's very inhuman.
The guards now had a set of playthings, and each night they would think of more and more creatively evil things to do with their playthings, with their prisoners. And all of them were demeaning, humiliating.
I love you, 293. Yeah, of course.
Today, it's impossible to look at this sexually tinged scene and not make comparisons with the abused and helpless prisoners from the Abu Ghraib prison.
Love you, 293. You're smart, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups.
What are you thinking as you watch that?
Just the crazy, sort of arbitrary, degrading.
This was sadistic.
Yeah, you bet it was.
It never occurred to you that you could be harming them?
No, it never crossed my mind.
Dave Eshelman says 30 years ago, he had no idea that forcing prisoners to embrace and taunting them with tirades backed up by a billy club could dehumanize his fellow students.
How far do you think you could have taken it?
When you look at the tapes, you say, my God, you did all of this. You inflicted this cruelty on your fellow human beings. What more could you have done? Don't know.
And Zimbardo says while some guards pushed the envelope, many others quietly stood by and let it happen, and he holds them equally responsible.
The good guards never, ever challenged the bad guards. Never once said, hey, why are you going crazy? Why are you getting into this so much? Why are you doing this?
So you're saying they're complicit because they didn't do anything?
They keep the system going. Evil persists in the world not only because there are bad people who do these terrible things, but it almost always is a silent majority who know what's going on and don't challenge it.
Where would Hitler be today if somebody had said this is wrong or tried to stop him? I mean, how many lives would have been saved if just, somebody stood up and said no?
Play leapfrog.
By the end of day 5, with the guards relishing their power trip, Zimbardo's experiment was out of control until this woman came to watch. Dr. Christina Maslach was a recent PhD psychology grad and former student of Zimbardo's.
I couldn't actually look at it. That's when I really began to feel sick to my stomach.
And I said, what's the matter? And she said, I think it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. They're not subjects, they're not guards, they're not prisoners, they're boys.
I just sort of turned away, and he got upset and angry.
And we had this huge argument. And in the middle of this argument, I suddenly stopped and say, God, you're right. You're right, of course. I mean, it's like a slap in the face. Wow.
At that moment, he realized what he'd created. The prison had become so real, he'd lost his own decency and perspective. Dr. Zimbardo recognized that his planned 2-week study was so dangerous, it had to end immediately after only 5 days.
Don't you go anywhere.
What do you think would have happened if your experiment had continued?
Oh, it's hate to even think about it.
Are you sorry that you did this? Are you
Listen,
sorry that you put these kids through this experiment?
Oh, I'm sorry that they suffered. I'm not sorry we did the study.
Because, he said, lessons were learned and lives were changed. Like Doug Corpy, the rebellion leader who broke down and had to be released.
I wanted to understand myself, so I went into psychology.
For the past quarter century, he's been a psychologist in the San Francisco correctional system.
The Stanford prison was a very benign prison situation, and it still caused guards to become sadistic, prisoners to become hysterical.
Dr. Christina Maslach, now a vice provost at California Berkeley. For 30 years, she stayed close to the man she snapped back to reality and then married. And of course, her husband, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, is still teaching at Stanford about the abuses of power then and now.
What would you do if you had total power over the people? Would you abuse it? Oh, no, I wouldn't do it. Well, our study says chances are pretty good that you might abuse it.
You'd be back, wouldn't you?
Are you ashamed of that now?
I'm ashamed of the way that I behaved, yeah. It's, not the way I lived my life, believe me.
Today, Dave Eshelman is a husband, father, and owner of his own mortgage company. A nice guy, a decent guy, an everyman who once did terrible things in a lab setting.
Assuming that I was this evil monster, how far could I have taken this? Given the right time and circumstances, I think we all have a place in us that's capable of this.
Get up, girls. Get up.
Haunting words from a disturbing experiment that seemed to foreshadow sadistic acts in an Iraqi prison 30 years later.
Experiments like the one at Stanford are no longer done for obvious ethical reasons, but the lessons from Dr. Zimbardo's study are still being taught in psychology classes across the country.
Okay. They kept referencing the Abu Ghraib scandal. I don't know how much you guys are familiar with the Abu Ghraib scandal. You were pretty young when this happened. But in 2003, when we when we went into Iraq, there was an American-held prison in Iraq called Abu Ghraib. And it turned out that shortly after they started the war, it came out that some of the American soldiers were abusing some of the Iraqi prisoners there. And in what's kind of an odd, not exactly coincidence, but some of the pictures that came out of the Abu Ghraib scandal, so this is a famous one of an American soldier basically toying with the prisoners there, bore a lot of resemblance to what happened in the actual Zimbardo study, which had actually occurred about 30 years earlier. There's kind of an eerie similarity between those two images. And in any case, part of the argument for the Abu Ghraib, or during the Abu Ghraib scandal, is that when you give people these roles like prison guards or something, they take on characteristics of what they associate with prison guards, and it leads to this sort of corrupting influence, and it can lead to this sort of abuse of powers. Okay, so what are we to take from that study? Well, first off, the point of the study was to see whether roles can affect people's behavior, and certainly they did, right? So if you look at, for instance, the guards' responses or the guards' behaviors and the prisoners' behaviors, what you see is that they tended to behave in ways that are consistent with people's ideas about how guards and prisoners should behave. So for instance, you see increasing escalation by the guards, increasing punishments. So they talked in that video about how near the beginning of the study, there was a rebellion that was staged by the prisoners and they refused to obey orders. And the prison guards didn't like that. So when the prisoners locked themselves in their rooms, they spent the next, I think, 3 hours, something like that, trying to break down those doors. And they took, I think, fire extinguishers and basically expelled the fire extinguishers into the offices to try to flush the prisoners out. And they eventually were able to regain order. And from that point on, they were increasingly punitive to the prisoners. So they would start making prisoners wash toilets with their bare hands, for instance. They made prisoners stand up in a closet, kind of like solitary confinement. They had to stand there for hours at a time. And they justified their action by saying they need to maintain order. And this sort of makes sense if you think about this in relation to cognitive dissonance theory, right? I mean, if these guards think, I'm a good person, but I'm being sort of aggressive or violent against these people, that would create some cognitive dissonance, right? But if they could justify their behaviors by saying, well, I have to behave this way because I have to maintain order, they're effectively reducing their perceived choice, right? They had no choice but to behave this way. Now, obviously they had a choice. They didn't have to, they weren't real guards and these weren't real prisoners. They didn't have to maintain any sort of order. It's sort of a way that they justified their behavior to reduce their complicity in it. You can also see how the uniform that they were given should tend to create de-individuation, right? If everyone's given identical uniforms, that creates that feeling of anonymity. We've seen that before in this class. If you give people identical uniforms, they start taking on characteristics of that group. So they start taking on characteristics of guards. So if they associate guards with maintaining order and being aggressive towards prisoners, then they start to take on those characteristics, which is exactly what we saw. So in other words, what we see here is that aggression can be partly instigated by the roles that we take on if those roles are associated with aggression. And at least as interesting as the guard responses, I think, are the prisoners' responses, the prisoners' behaviors in the Stanford Prison Study as well. You can see how they get dehumanized and isolated after a while, right? They're being dehumanized by the guards. They're being referred to by numbers instead of names, for instance. And what happens is that these prisoners start to learn to behave in a helpless fashion. So after that rebellion that I mentioned, when the guards started to try to impose order and discipline the prisoners started to impose order on themselves. So in other words, if one prisoner started to talk back to the guards, the other prisoners would try to get that one to shut up because that meant that they were going to get punishments themselves. So they were learning, in other words, not to stand up to the guards, not to fight back, just to accept their role. And again, I have to remind people, they didn't have to do anything the guards said, right? They weren't actual prisoners. They didn't have to do a single thing the guards told them to do, and yet they did. They went along with it, right? Because they had adopted that role of being a prisoner. There was a point in time where they had a mock parole hearing. So all the prisoners went up in front of this parole board and pled their case for why they should be released. And Zimbardo had set it up such that the parole board basically denies everybody parole. And at that point, the prisoners who all really did want to leave, they wanted to get out of this study, could have just said, that's it, I'm done, I'm leaving the study, and walked out, right? They're not being held, they can't be held against their will, that'd be kidnapping. They could just walk out of that study, but they didn't. They all just sort of walked back to their cells, right? Because they had so adopted this role of prisoner, they couldn't even think outside of that box they'd constructed for themselves. What's also really interesting, I think, is that Zimbardo, the experimenter, he designed the study to look at the effect that roles have on our behavior. And in what's sort of an ironic twist to the study, he himself got so caught up in his role, he lost sort of perspective on the situation as well. So at one point, they mentioned in that video that one of the prisoners had to be released, right? And so there was a rumor that started to spread among the prisoners and among the guards that that person who had been released was going to get a bunch of his buddies and have a prison break one night. And they're going to break into the prison and take all the prisoners out of there. Okay. Now it's just a rumor, but that was the rumor that was going through the prison. So Zimbardo, what had happened is that at this point, he had sort of taken on the role of prison warden, right? And so he viewed a prison break as sort of usurping his power, and he didn't like that. So what he did is he went to the actual police and tried to use their actual jail cells to move the prisoners into those jail cells that night that they were supposed to break in, so that they couldn't break out the prisoners. And it was only later that he realized that he had gotten so caught up in his role that he had lost perspective, and he would admit that today. That's what happened. So it's sort of ironic that in the very study in which he was looking at how roles affect people's behavior, he got so caught up in his own role as prison warden that it affected his behavior as well, right? That's how powerful these roles are in terms of affecting our behavior. Another point I want to make is that the social roles, these roles that people were given, outweighed people's personality in terms of affecting their behavior. So for instance, before this study was conducted, Zimbardo gave all of the participants some like psychological assessments to make sure they're all sort of sound of mind. And they took some personality tests and things like that. And at the end of the study, what he could do is you can correlate how aggressive people were with these various personality traits. And what he found is that basically none of those personality traits had any association with how aggressive people were. The only thing that was associated with how aggressive people were was whether they had been assigned to play a role of prison guard or prisoner. If you'd been assigned to play the role of prison guard, you were much more likely to be aggressive than if you were assigned to play the role of prisoner, right? Much more important in a sense than personality in terms of affecting our behavior. which is very much consistent with social psychology in general, right? Which looks at how the situation affects our behavior. It would be a mistake, therefore, to assume that these prison guards were just sadistic, aggressive people. And I think you see that when they talk to that one, or the person who used to be a prison guard, Dave Eshelman, I think his name was. He's obviously not a bad guy. He's got his own business and everything else. He doesn't seem like a sadistic person, but he was placed in an extraordinary situation which resulted in this behavior, right? We'd be engaging in the fundamental attribution error, in other words, if we attributed his aggressive behavior during the Stanford prison study to him being a naturally aggressive person as part of his personality. That's the fundamental attribution error, right? We should be attributing it to the social role that he was given to play. And so all of this, I think, leads to this overall conclusion, I think, which is something I've said before in this class, which is that it's sort of easy for us to think that there are good people and bad people in the world and divide the world up that way, right? And I think what studies like the Stanford prison experiment shows, and what studies like Milgram's experiment, where people thought they were delivering lethal shocks to someone else, I think part of the reason these studies are so famous is because it breaks down that perception, right? Because what these studies show is that almost all of us have the potential to do evil if we're placed in the right circumstances. And almost all of us have the potential to do good if we're placed in the right circumstances. And so we need to break down this idea that the world is composed of good people and bad people. Rather, it's composed of people that have the potential to do good or evil, depending on the situations that they find themselves in. And I think that nuance is important to understand. Last thing I want to mention is that there were certainly ethical concerns with this study, and you could not conduct the study today. The study was done before we had institutional review boards that review the ethics of our research. You could never do the study today because of the way that the prisoners were being treated in the study. In fact, after the study was conducted, Stanley Milgram called up Philip Zimbardo and thanked him for doing the study because all the heat was off of him for his study and was now on Zimbardo for this. So, but although we couldn't do either the Milgram study or the Zimbardo study today, I think they led to really important findings about the nature of human behavior. And that's why they've sort of stood the test of time and are so important in the history of social psychology. Okay, so that is all I've got for the aggression section. Before we move on to the last topic of the semester, though, let's have quiz 13. So let's go into Top Hat.
Fucking on.
Okay, everyone's in Top Hat. These questions all have to do with aggression. Oh, it's not on the board. Why is that? Sorry, guys, hold on one second. I thought it was. In fact, I have no idea why it's not on the board right now. Let's get here. Okay, I guess the PowerPoint is still on. Okay, that's showing for you now, right? Okay, so let's get started. Question number 1. The fact that heat can increase aggression is usually explained through which of the following concepts? Is it misattribution of arousal, social learning theory, the frustration aggression hypothesis, or evolutionary theory? You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we talked about this last class where we talked about how heat can increase aggression, and the reason it does so is because heat tends to increase arousal, which can then be misattributed to aggression, which makes option A the correct answer. Question number 2. Betty, an anti-war activist, is mad at the president for leading the country to war. Because she can't go straight to the source of her frustration, she takes out her aggression on her next door neighbor, Wilma, instead. The situation sounds most like an example of which of the following? Is it relational aggression, instrumental aggression, desensitization, or displacement? You got 10 seconds. Three, 2, 1. All right, so we have an instance where we've got someone who is frustrated, which leads to the motivation to aggress. That should give you a hint that we're talking about the frustration aggression hypothesis here. But she can't take out her frustration against the person who's the source, so she takes it out on an alternative target. That is known as displacement, D, according to the frustration aggression hypothesis. Question number 3. As part of therapy, a clinical psychologist encourages her patients to install a punching bag in their homes to release hostility. This therapist apparently believes in, is it social learning theory, the catharsis hypothesis, misattribution of arousal, or social exchange theory? You got 10 seconds. And everyone's responded. Okay. So the idea here is that the therapist apparently has is that if you have hostility, that you should release it against a punching bag, which would then reduce your levels of hostility. That's known as the catharsis hypothesis. Perfect. And as you should know, that doesn't seem to hold up to empirical research. It seems that if you hit a punching bag while you're angry, that'll only maintain your anger longer. It doesn't actually drain it, contrary to the catharsis hypothesis. Question 4, which of the following was not observed in the Stanford prison study? So A, many guards became to behave aggressively towards the prisoners. B, many prisoners learned to behave helplessly to minimize the abuse from the guards. C, the guards became de-individuated as a result of the uniforms. Or D, prisoners bonded with each other more than the guards bonded with each other due to the increased stress of being a prisoner. We got 10 seconds. Three, 2, 1. Okay, so we just saw that options A through C are all true. But we never talked about anything about the prisoners bonding with each other more than the guards. So option D is the correct answer there. And finally, question 5. Results from the Stanford prison experiment demonstrated that the biggest predictor of how aggressively participants behaved in the study was A, the role that they'd been assigned, guard or prisoner, B, how antisocial they were before the study, C, the temperature of the room they were in, or D, their score on the various Big 5 personality factors. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, and this one should be extremely easy. I'm really looking for 100% on this one. Obviously, it was the role, A, that they'd been assigned to play. Yes, all right, perfect. Okay, only one quiz left, and obviously only one class left. So be ready for a quiz next class. All right, new topic and last topic, as a matter of fact. And before I get into any research or any concepts or ideas here, I want to tell you a couple stories. And I want you to think about the behavior of the people in these stories and what might have caused it. Talitha Word was a 33-year-old woman in 1995 when she was coming home at about 2 a.m. And on her way home, this is in Detroit, on her way home, she was crossing over a bridge and she got into a minor fender bender. She accidentally rear-ended the person in front of her. Nothing major, no injuries, anything like that, just a minor fender bender. The guy she rear-ended was Martel Welch. Now, Martel Welch is a big guy. He's like 270 pounds. He's over 6 feet tall. And he contrasts a lot with Talitha Word, who's under 5 feet tall, who's 115 pounds, right? So he's just way, way bigger than she is. And when Talitha Word hits Martel Welch, he gets infuriated. And he leaves his car and he starts yelling at her. And he goes up to her driver's side window and starts yelling at her and berating her. In fact, he unlocks her door and grabs her and drags her out of the car while he's yelling at her. And in the process of doing so, ends up ripping some of her clothes off. And he starts yelling that he's going to kill her for hitting him with her car. And after some more of this yelling and screaming at her, he goes back to his car to grab a tire iron, which he then approaches her in her car and starts smashing her windows with the tire iron, and then turns towards Talitha Word and threatens to use it on her as well. At this point, Talitha Word is terrified, as you can imagine, and she decides that instead of facing this attack, she's going to instead take her chances by jumping off the bridge into the waters below, which she does. The waters are pretty cold. It's 2 a.m. in Detroit, and I can't remember what time of the year it was, but the waters were pretty cold. And she's sort of only semi-conscious to begin with after being abused by Martel Welch, okay, who had, by the way, I forgot to mention, had taken her head and smashed it into her car a few times as well, to the hood. So she's obviously a little bit out of it. When she hits the water, she's probably even a little more out of it and a little bit more confused. And at this point, 2 men who happen to cross the scene at the moment see Talitha Word in the water. They immediately take off their jackets and jump in the water after her. Now, Talitha Word probably thinks that these 2 people, or these people, because she's so confused, she's basically semi-conscious at this point, she probably thinks they're coming to attack her some more, and she's terrified all over again and tries to get away from them. Unfortunately, she ends up slipping under the water and drowning that night. Now, this attack took over somewhere between 10 to 25 minutes for the entire attack to take place. And what's sort of shocking is that while it took place over 10 to 25 minutes, 38 people watched and no one did anything. In fact, the 2 people that jumped in the water after her were the only 2 people who had not seen that whole attack. They just came across the scene after she had jumped in the water. And this led Talitha Word's mother to later exclaim, "I can't believe all those people stood around and watched." This is Kitty Genovese. She was a 28-year-old bartender in Queens, New York, back in 1960, what is it, 63 or 68? I think it's 68, something like that. And she was coming home after a shift. This is about 3:20 in the morning. And she parks her car outside her apartment complex and starts walking towards her building. And she sees out of the corner of her eye someone standing in the shadows, kind of a silhouette, right? And she gets a little nervous. She starts walking a little faster towards her building. And then she hears footsteps behind her and she starts running towards her building. And then the footsteps behind her start running as well. And they catch up with her. And the man who's in the shadows grabs her from behind, pulls out a knife and stabs her in the back. And she screams out in pain. And a window in one of the apartments opens up and a man leans out and says, "Leave that girl alone." And Kitty Genovese's attacker drops Kitty on the ground and runs away. Now, Kitty Genovese is still alive, but she's very badly injured. And she starts crawling towards her apartment complex. She gets into the lobby area. She opens the door from the outside, gets into the lobby area and collapses on the inside. And a few minutes later, her attacker comes back. He had set out that night to kill someone, and he has not finished his job yet. So he starts hunting Kitty. And he sees the trail of blood she left when she crawled into the lobby. And he follows that trail of blood. And he opens the door and he sees her passed out, semi-conscious, lying in the lobby. And while she's there, he rapes her, steals $49 from her, and then leaves her to die. The whole attack takes about 30 minutes or so from start to finish. The first call to police goes in a couple minutes after the attacker leaves, and the police are on the scene within minutes. Now, she's still alive at this time, and they put her in the ambulance, but she dies on the way to the hospital. When the investigators, the detectives, start interviewing people the next day, what they discover shocks them because no fewer than 40 people saw or heard some part of that attack. And yet the first call to police did not go in until 2 minutes or so after the attacker left. So about 30 minutes or more after the attack actually started. Had someone called the police earlier, maybe Kitty Genovese's life could have been saved. And this finding, the fact that 40 people saw or heard some part of the attack, shocked people in New York. This is all over the papers. And people started saying, well, this just shows the extent to which we've become disassociated from one another, the extent to which we just don't care about each other anymore. But a couple of social psychologists at the time thought that there might have been a different explanation. And on the basis of this real world case, they sketched out a theory of helping behavior, which we're going to look at a little bit later on. January 13th, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 takes off from Washington, D.C. in the middle of a snowstorm. And the storm is so bad that the pilots quickly lose control of the plane, which crashes into the Potomac River. Now, this is January in Washington, D.C., so these rivers are freezing cold, right? And so the majority of people die on impact and are killed in the crash, but there are a few survivors of this plane crash, but they're in the water, in this freezing cold water. And they're all huddled around the only part of the plane that's out of the water, which is this tail section. So you can imagine a bunch of people huddled around this tail section. Now, they've just survived the plane crash, and they're now at risk of dying due to hypothermia, right? So very quickly, a helicopter is dispatched, and this rescue helicopter starts hovering over the tail section of the plane and drops down kind of like a rope ladder to where people are. And the first man that grabs the rope ladder, instead of taking it for himself, he decides to give it to someone else. And that person grabs onto the rope ladder. The helicopter then drags them basically over to the bank of the river, drops the person off on the bank, goes back, drops that rope ladder again. And again, the same man grabs the rope ladder. And again, instead of taking it for himself, he gives it to someone else. And over, this is what happens, right? The helicopter's going back and forth, dragging survivors from the tail section of the plane to the bank of the river and then going back. And every time that same man grabs that rope ladder and gives it to someone else. One of the people that he gives it to, her name is Priscilla Tirado. She's just lost her husband and her newborn baby in this plane crash, who have just died on impact. And she's barely alive herself. She's at very high risk of just slipping under the waters and drowning. And when she grabs the rope ladder, when she takes it from this guy who keeps handing it off to people, when she takes it, the helicopter starts dragging her over to the bank. And then halfway there, she can't hang on anymore, and she falls into the water. And now there's no tail section to hang on to, and there's no other people to help her. Now, while this is all happening, there's a bunch of people who are watching from the side of the Potomac River. And one of these guys, one of the people who's watching this all take place, his name is Lenny Skutnik. And he sees Priscilla Tirado fall into the water. And immediately he takes off his jacket and jumps in the water after her, risking his own life to save the life of a woman he's never met before. And he successfully does so. He saved her life that day. Meanwhile, the helicopter keeps going back and forth and is rescuing people one at a time. And finally, after everyone's been rescued, because this guy keeps grabbing it, keeps giving it to someone else, he's the last one left, and it goes back one last time, and it drops the rope ladder, and the man that had saved the lives of everyone else is nowhere to be found. In fact, that man, who was known for a while as the unknown hero, is the only person, he ended up drowning, he's the only person who ended up dying after the plane crash. He had basically saved the lives of everybody else. They later discovered his name was Arland D. Williams, and there is now a street named after him, I believe, in DC. So if you're ever in DC and you see that street, that's from this story here. And if you take this story and you contrast it with the first two, the contrast couldn't be starker, right? In the first two stories, we have instances of 38 people or 40 people who seem to be doing nothing to help someone, who are watching these emergencies go down, do nothing to help. And now in this story, we have the case of Arland D. Williams, who basically gave his life in order to save the lives of strangers, and Lenny Skutnik, who risked his life to save the life of Priscilla Tirado. So how do we explain the extreme differences in these behaviors, in these situations? How do we explain how sometimes people seem to be completely unwilling to help, and other times people become heroes and are willing to risk or even sacrifice their lives to save others? We're gonna look into this a little bit. One more story. 1996, a 3-year-old boy at the Chicago Zoo is looking at the gorilla enclosure, and the way you look at it is kind of from up on high. And as he's leaning over the railing to get a better view, he falls into the gorilla enclosure, falling 20 feet, hitting his head on the concrete below and knocking himself unconscious. And as if that isn't horrifying enough, the gorillas start approaching this boy, who is completely unconscious. And onlookers are horrified as these gorillas approach this boy. Well, the first gorilla to get to this little boy, her name is Binti. This is a picture of Binti. And as you can see, instead of ripping this boy limb from limb, instead what she does is she picks up the boy and cradles him in her arms, which you can see in this picture. She takes him to the opening to the gorilla enclosure where like the zookeepers come in, and she lays him in front of the doors there. When the other gorillas approach him, she growls at them to make sure they back off. She then backs off from the boy, and as a consequence, the zookeepers are able to get into the enclosure and save the life of this boy. So effectively, Binti saved this boy's life. Binti was hailed as a hero, as you can imagine. In fact, I believe that she was Time Magazine's Person of the Year that year, which is funny because she's not a person. But nonetheless, she was hailed as a hero, right? But that's not the whole story, because some people had a bit of a different impression as to what happened that day. Because after some research, some people noted that Binti herself, when she was younger, had been abandoned by her own mother. And as a consequence, in the zoo, when Binti had her own baby, she didn't know how to take care of it because she never learned it from her mother. And she had a 17-month-old baby, I think. And so what had happened in the years leading up to this incident is that the zookeepers had been training Binti on how to care for her own offspring. Specifically, what they'd done is they had given her a doll, and they had trained her to hold that doll, to cradle it in her arms. And if there's ever anything wrong with the doll, they trained her to lay it in front of the doors to the enclosure and back off so the zookeepers could come in and give it medical attention. And so the question that arises then is, what was the motive for Binti's behavior that day? Was she a hero? Did she recognize that there was a child in distress and save its life? Or was she simply acting out a series of learned behaviors that she had learned with this doll? Now, this is obviously debatable, and it's hard to get into the mind of a gorilla, of course, but it really raises questions as to people's or I guess to, in this case, a gorilla's, but also to people's underlying motivations when they help. Are people helping for truly altruistic reasons? Did Binti help for a truly altruistic reason? Or was there something else going on here? We're going to look at that question in this class as well. So we're going to start with this question. Is there such a thing as true altruism or not? And I'm going to give you two different perspectives on this. The first perspective is drawn from a theory we've already discussed in this class, something called social exchange theory. So Social exchange theory, if you recall, we talked about this in terms of people making decisions as to whether to stay or leave a relationship. And so the basic idea behind social exchange theory is that people are always trying to maximize their rewards and minimize their costs, right? And so in relation to relationships, what I had mentioned is that people look at the pros and cons of staying in a relationship and the pros and cons of leaving a relationship, and they pick which one maximizes their benefits and minimizes their costs, right? And that same theory is applied to basically any other human behavior as well. You could apply it to helping, for instance, which is what we're doing here. And so the basic idea here is that, according to social exchange theorists, is that there is no such thing as true altruism. They would say that people will help only if the rewards or the perceived rewards they get outweigh the costs to someone. So let's go into this a little bit more in depth. So what are some rewards that we get from helping? Well, at the very least, most people feel good after helping someone else, right? And that good feeling that we have that we did something helpful to someone else is itself a reward for helping. It's not the only reward. You can also get rewards in terms of social approval, right? If people hail you as a hero, we like it when people think positively of us. That's very much a reward. It boosts our self-esteem, which we've seen in this class many times, is very much a reward for our behavior. Or maybe you volunteer at a hospital, but not because you care about the patients, but because you know it looks good on a resume and you're enhancing your job prospects later on or something like that, right? So there's all sorts of rewards that are associated with helping. At the same time, there's also a lot of costs associated with helping. There's potential harm. If you interfere with someone who's being attacked, well, then you might get attacked, right? There could be bodily harm. If you jump in this river to save the life of this woman, you might drown in that river as well. So it's obvious harm there. There's also potential embarrassment to helping. Maybe you are walking on South Beach and you see someone passed out and you go to give them CPR and it turns out that they were only sunbathing, right? That's pretty embarrassing to give someone CPR and it turns out they don't need it. So there's a cost associated with helping. Or you might want to volunteer in a hospital to help your job prospects. At the same time, it's very time consuming and you can't do the other things that you would like to be doing. Or you can think of it in another way. You can think of the cost associated with not helping. So let's say that you're walking downtown and someone asks you, a homeless person asks you for $1, right? You may give them that $1 and it might not be because you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart. It might be because you know that if you don't give them that $1, you're going to feel guilty for the next half hour. And it's worth $1 to not feel guilty, right? So the point is, according to a social exchange theorist, we have to do all these calculations and figure out what are the rewards, what are the costs, you weigh them up and you determine if the rewards outweigh the costs. And if the rewards do outweigh the costs, we'll help. And if the rewards don't outweigh the costs, we won't help. So the idea here is that people will help, but they'll do it for purely egoistic reasons. In fact, a social exchange theorist might say that every behavior you have ever done and every behavior you ever will do is ultimately aimed at this egoistic motive, at benefiting you in some way. And it's kind of hard to argue this sometimes because any act of helping you can imagine, you can always come up with some rewards that the person gets. At the very least, they feel good about themselves for doing it, right? So a social exchange theorist says there's no such thing as true altruism. Every behavior is fundamentally egoistic in nature. However, there's an alternative theory as well. And in this alternative theory, which is known as the empathy altruism hypothesis, these researchers believe that there is such a thing as true altruism. They would say that all help is not self-serving. They would agree with social exchange theorists that a lot of behaviors are based on these egoistic motives. They would say that a lot of helping is in fact self-serving, but not all of it. They would say that there are some specific instances where there is truly altruistic helping. But it'll only happen if we experience what's known as empathy. Okay, empathy refers to the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes. So the idea here is that if you come across someone who needs help, if you feel empathy for that person, if you can imagine what it's like to be in their shoes and the suffering they're going through, then you will help them, not because it benefits you in any way, but purely out of a motivation to reduce their distress, out of a purely altruistic motive. Caroline, I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say debunked by the fundamental attribution error. If you could explain that a bit more. So here's the basic idea, right? So if you observe someone in need of help, and as I said, if you feel empathy for the person, or I should say, if you don't feel empathy for that person, they're not saying you won't help. They're saying that's when social exchange theory will kick in. You'll still help, but only if the rewards outweigh the costs, right? So you'll help, but only for this egoistic motive. On the other hand, if you do feel empathy for this person, you're not going to weigh the pros and cons at all. You're not even going to consider them. You'll help them regardless of the rewards and costs. And so the motivation for helping in this case is purely altruistic. You're doing it purely to reduce their suffering. But of course, these researchers can't simply claim this. They have to provide a test for this idea. So let me describe to you the basic test. So imagine you're a participant. So you show up for a study, and I, as the researcher, tell you that you're the first person here. There's actually 2 participants. You're one. The other participant's not here yet. So what I'll do is I'll put you in a little small room by yourself while we wait for the other participant. And while you're in this small room, I'm going to have you learn a little bit about the person you're going to be working with. Okay, this person you're going to be working with, her name is Elaine. Do you have a question? Oh, you're stretching. Okay. Her name is Elaine, and you are given a questionnaire that Elaine supposedly filled out. Okay, and you can read the answers to the questions that were asked of her. So you can learn a little bit about her. Okay. Finally, when Elaine gets there, I should say that the room that you're in has a TV monitor, which is hooked up to a video camera that's in an adjacent room. Okay, so you're seeing this all in the video camera. So when Elaine gets there, you see her being placed into the other room. Now, what the researcher says is that as part of the study, one person is going to receive electric shocks, and the other person is going to observe that person receiving electric shocks. And because you were here first, you're the one that's going to be observing. Elaine's going to be receiving the electric shocks. Okay. So your role basically is to watch while Elaine receives electric shocks. Now, importantly, of course, in any study where some participants getting electric shocks, there are no actual electric shocks being delivered because we can't do that in our studies. So Elaine is actually working with the experimenter, right? There's no actual other participant. But what's happened is that when you read that questionnaire about Elaine, about her interest and her personality, it was actually manipulated by the experimenter such that her answers are either going to be really similar to you or very dissimilar to you. Because what had happened is about 3 months prior to the study, you had filled out a bunch of questionnaires as part of another study. And based on your answers to those questionnaires, the researchers created this fake response, this fake questionnaire from Elaine, and that was designed to be either highly similar to you or very dissimilar to you. And that was their manipulation of empathy. So the basic idea is that if someone is very similar to us, it's very easy to put ourselves into their shoes, and therefore we have high empathy for that person. And if someone's very different from us, it's very difficult to put ourselves into their shoes, and therefore we have low empathy. So basically, that's how the researchers manipulated empathy. Okay, there 1 second. So what happens is this. So you start by watching Elaine receive a series of electric shocks, and it's after a few shocks, it's obvious that Elaine is in a lot of distress. Okay, and the researcher apparently also sees this, because you're seeing this all in this monitor in the room that you're in. The researcher enters her room and says, look, I know there's still a few shocks left that we have to give you, but I can tell you're in distress. I think we should stop the study right now. And Elaine says, no, that's okay. Now that we started, I know the study's important. I want to receive those electric shocks. Like I know I'm not reacting all that well to them, but I want to follow through with this. And the researcher says, I just don't know if we can do this. I'm not sure. Then says, oh, you know what? I've got an idea. And he leaves Elaine's room and he comes into your room. And he says, look, you've been watching what's happening here. Elaine's been receiving these shocks. She's not handling it well, but she wants to continue. I have another idea. What we could do is this. We could have a situation, we could swap places. So you would receive the rest of the shocks and Elaine watches you. We could do that. Now, you don't have to do this. I mean, after all, you were the first one here, fair and square, that you don't have to receive these electric shocks. It's all Elaine. But you can, if you want, choose to switch places with her. Now, here's the thing. At this point, I also randomly assign you to a condition in which you're either allowed to leave or not allowed to leave. Here's what that means. In the allowed to leave condition, I tell you, if you don't want to switch places with Elaine, that's fine. We had enough observations. We don't need you for the rest of the study. You can leave and never have to think about this again. Okay, so Elaine will still receive her shocks, but you won't even be here. You don't have to observe her. That's in the allowed to leave condition. It's sometimes called the easy escape condition. In the not allowed to leave condition, I tell you, If you don't want to switch places with Elaine, that's fine, but you still have to watch her receive the rest of her shocks. Now, what the researchers are asking here, what they really want to know, is will the participants help Elaine by switching places with her? Okay. So what I'm going to show you on the next slide is the percentage of people who agreed to switch places with Elaine. Now, obviously, they didn't actually receive any shocks. As soon as they made their choice, the study ended, right? So, but this is the percentage of participants who agreed to switch places with Elaine. I'm going to describe these results, and then I'll walk you through how it supports the empathy altruism hypothesis. Okay, so we're going to start with the high empathic concern condition. These are participants who were led to believe Elaine was exactly like them. Okay. Now, what you can see first off is that the percentage of people who agree to help her by switching places is pretty high. It's between 80 and 90%, depending on this condition here. Okay. And what's the most important thing to note here is that whether these people were able to escape, were able to leave the study or not, didn't really matter. This little difference here is basically not meaningful. Okay. It didn't really matter. They were equally likely to help her, regardless of whether they themselves could leave the study or not. And that's going to be important for reasons in a second. In the low empathy condition, however, what we see is, of course, first off, the overall rates of helping are going to be lower because if you don't have empathy for someone, you don't put yourself in their shoes, you're probably less likely to help them to begin with. But what's particularly important is that suddenly, whether you can escape the situation or not really matters. Okay? So here's the basic idea. Imagine you're in this low empathy condition. So you don't have any empathy for Elaine. According to the empathy altruism hypothesis, if you don't have empathy for someone, that's when social exchange theory kicks in. You'll only help if the rewards outweigh the costs. So what's happening here is that people in the difficult escape condition, people are told that you have to watch, if you don't switch places, you have to watch Elaine receive the rest of the shocks. They start thinking, well, yeah, I could not switch places with her, but then I'm going to feel really, really guilty, right? Because I have to watch her receive those shocks, and I could have taken them and I didn't, and I'm going to feel really guilty about that. I don't want to feel guilty. You know what? I'm going to switch places with her. Not because they had altruistic motivations, but because they knew they'd feel guilty if they didn't. And the reason we know that is because if among the people in the easy escape condition, almost no one helps Elaine, right? If these people are able to leave the study and never have to worry about Elaine again, that's what they end up doing in this condition. In other words, what we're seeing here is basically social exchange theory, that people are deciding to help based on whether it benefits them or not. If they can just leave the study and never have to worry about Elaine, that's what they'll do because that's what benefits them the most. If they're not able to leave the study, okay, they'll switch places with her because they don't want to feel guilty, right? So the fact that these are different means that they're considering how easy the escape is for them. They're taking their own egoistic concerns into consideration. But in the high empathy condition, if you have high empathy for Elaine, according to the empathy altruism hypothesis, you're going to help regardless of the rewards and costs. You're not going to consider about whether you can escape the situation or not, because that's not what's driving your motivation. As a consequence, you're equally likely to help her in both conditions, right? If people were behaving completely selfishly here, then you'd expect to see the same thing, that in the easy escape condition, no one gives help because they could just leave the situation. So the fact that they're still willing to help in the easy escape condition means that they're not really concerned about their own motivation. They're only concerned about helping Elaine. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So researchers have used these data to argue that there is such thing as true altruism if you experience high empathy for someone. Then you don't weigh the rewards and costs. Now, I will also say, however, that social exchange theorists have a different interpretation of this. Okay. So the battle is still on. The battle still goes back and forth as to whether there's such a thing as true altruism or not. But I wanted to present sort of both sides of that issue. Just to get back to Caroline again, if you try to explain someone's altruistic behavior, don't you run the risk of misattributing their behavior to an internal desire to feel like a good person? So certainly it's the case that, well, I'm not sure who all the yous are in the sentence first off. But yes, if you attribute people's helping behavior to an internal cause, they're helping because they're a good person, you might be engaging in the fundamental attribution error. It could be the case, like we saw with this study, that people are helping, like in the low empathy concern, not because they're concerned about Elaine, but because they're concerned about their own motivations. So it's certainly the case that when we're explaining helping behavior, we have the tendency to fall prey to the fundamental attribution error. That's certainly true. All right, it's 4:45. I'm going to end things here. Remember, one more time, assignment 3 is due 3:30 on Thursday via Canvas. Make sure you turn that in. And make sure that you do all of the additional extra credit opportunities as well, because you have, one of them expires by Thursday's class as well. The other one you have till Friday. So make sure you do those ASAP as well. Okay. All right, guys, I will see you on Thursday for our last class of the semester. Okay, bye.